Good afternoon. I'm Kate McFarlane, co-director of Drawing Room. Welcome to Drawing Room and to the Abstract Drawing Seminar. Thank you for coming. It's been a great pleasure to work with Richard Deacon over the past 3 years to develop this, what we think is a very impressive exhibition. And we're looking forward to looking at it in a bit more detail during the seminar today. Just to say that artist-curated exhibitions are a very important strand of our programme, with previous exhibitions having been curated by Thomas Scheibitz, Olivia Plender, and David Musgrave. And the artists bring to curating a very different kind of perspective, which is informed, obviously, by their own practice and the ideas that inform that. Anyway, Richard is obviously going to talk about how he's approached curating abstract drawing. You all have a copy of the schedule. So we'll, after Richard's spoken, then Anna Lovatt will give her talk, and then we'll have a break. So without any further ado, I take great pleasure in introducing Richard Deacon. Welcome, Richard. Do you want to sit here?
Good afternoon. Welcome to the seminar. When I was approached by Kate and Mary to consider if I'd think about curating a drawing show, I'd had two ideas. One was the beginnings of the idea for the show which you see before you. And the other was a show concentrating on drawings that are very different in character, but I think somehow connected. Over the years, I've been interested in people who draw as a kind of witnessing activity, and have tried to either look at or collect publications on such drawings. And I'm thinking of things like Roland Searle's prison camp drawings, or the set of drawings from Cambodia during the years of Pol Pot, or some German drawings from the Russian front, or actually also of courtroom drawings, since you're not allowed to take photographs in the courtroom. Drawing remains the means of reportage of court events. And in fact, you're not even allowed to draw in the courtroom. So all the courtroom drawings you see are done from memory. They're not actually done in the courtroom. And that way in which drawing could displace photography or is used when it was impossible to take photographs, when photography was not an issue, or in times before photography was the currency of news, interests me. And the crossover, I think, with this with the selection for abstract drawing, which is perhaps not obvious, has to do with some notion that the mark can be attached to the real. And I've also talked about the origins of the abstraction or abstract mark making as being a kind of activity that predates representational drawing in the history of human cultural activities, and that abstract mark making isn't to do with decoration so much as to do with identification, and that it's to do with saying either this is mine or this piece of stuff is important. It's kind of it's a way of signifying that that has a kind of strong history. And at the same time, there's also a sense in which the abstract patterning can become as a peripheral activity. There's another kind of another sense in the history of art that the peripheral breeds the center, and it's out of the peripheral decorative activities that the center emerges. So grotesque as a category kind of comes from grotto and from kind of scratchings as a chain of ideas. So, and when that first idea for the show seemed to be kind of hard to realize, then I looked into the microphone just fallen to the floor. I looked into this idea of abstract drawing, and as I say in the catalogue, I mean, in some senses, all drawing's abstract. You know, it's just marks on a surface, and trying to refine down a bit what I thought. It became clear that I was trying to think about drawings that were not for anything else, but basically drawings that were in themselves and done and produced for their own sake. And I also thought that the abstract was somehow identified with the 20th and the 21st century as kind of categories of activity. I could look at other things. I could look at some African tribal productions or whatever, and find associations, or at Indian and Chinese, early Indian and Chinese art, and find associations. But it was by wanting to begin at the beginning of the 20th century, it seemed to kind of seemed to bring things into focus. I mean, it's curious to wonder why it was that at the beginning of the 20th century, the idea that you could produce a different kind of thing became a lively issue for artists. And in thinking about it, some of the earliest abstraction is very well known. So Malevich was kind of a clear candidate, and as would have been Kandinsky. But after a show at Camden that Jenny Lomax did in Camden 4 or 5 years ago, I'd got very interested in the Swedish artist Hilmar af Klint, who is now much better known, which is a great thing, and who's with a group of friends in Sweden, in rural Sweden at the beginning of the 20th century, was doing something really quite extraordinary, and trying to find a way of putting down on paper an experience which they really didn't know what to call, trying to invent a new way of seeing, a new way of describing. And we're very fortunate to have in the show one of those very early notebooks, drawing notebooks of hers, which are, I mean, they're visionary. I've used the metaphor of transmitters, receivers, and the channel as ways of talking about most of the drawings within the show. But it seemed to be important that this isn't an overall survey. It's kind of, this is a group of drawings that interest me, but it has some historical depth, and that therefore I needed to try and select things that were from very early on, which is why the Malevich and the Klimt are included. But it also seemed important that there shouldn't be one strand. There should be two strands at the beginning, and even three in a sense. That and the Pollock kind of represents a sort of third strand. Although when you go next door and see the set of the way in which they're hung, the sequence of from the Klimt round to the Richard Serra, there's a sense of conversation among all of those among that group, in that when you look at the page of the Klimt notebook, there's a kind of transfer of an accidental transfer of from the page that's open onto the opposite page, so that the drawing is kind of mirrored. And then next to it, the Dorothea Rockburn is an intentional transfer from the carbon paper to the drawn square opposite. And then the Pollock next to that is also a transfer, in the sense that it's a drawing made on two sheets of paper. The top sheet has been allowed to bleed through to the bottom, and it's the bottom sheet that we have here. And that so there's three kinds of transfer involved in that. One, the kind of there's also a sense in which that transferring process corresponds to the ways in which the ways in which we as artists look at things and take things from them. Or we could take, and so, and I thought of that kind of transfer process in relationship to in that it's centered on the materiality of the process of drawing, spun my selection off in a whole variety of other ways. There's a certain kind of automatism involved in in thinking about the way that the Pollock is transferred from one to the other. It's kind of filtered through the paper, and there's also a kind of distancing involved in that process of filtering through the paper, and that kind of distancing is characteristic of a number of other drawings which interested me, that to do with trying to use a mechanical apparatus to draw, and I don't think I didn't think it was so different to dripping paint and allowing it to filter through a kind of a material there, to using a machine which acts also as a filter between you and the mark. So that leads on to typewriter, in a way, to typewriter drawing, the typewriter drawing of Anni Albers in the same in the cabinet in the same room, and Anni Albers is writing on weaving. Has always been something that I've been interested in, and that particular type drawing with the brackets kind of forming that wonderful wave across the surface has always been a drawing that I liked. So the and that the so the and then there's the relationship between that apparent weave and her own activity as a weaver, and then the history of weaving as a machine-based activity, guided by some of the very early control processes using punch cards. And so the second Anni Albers drawing, which is made with pinpricks, refers to that punch card process. And it's also a very beautiful and sensitive drawing, and it's the along with the Gordon Matter Clark, it's one of the few drawings in the show that's made by an attack on the surface rather than a mark on the surface. The drawing is done by penetrating the surface. And I think Anna's going to talk more kind of cogently about this than I am, but that sense of the control process being kind of slightly given over to the machine, or the ways in which you don't give it over to them, the way that you act as an artist in relationship to something like the control process of that allows the drawing to emerge, is a feature of a number of the selections. So reading on from the Albers, we can and the Pollock, we could also talk about the mirror chandelles that are around the corner, which are also produced by a kind of semi-automatic process, in that the paper is put over a bed of color, which has been a bed of black color, which has been powdered, and then the light mark allows the ink to bleed through from underneath onto the rice paper on top. So it's a kind of act of drawing in negative. You let the rather than you putting the mark on the surface, you let the surface put the mark on the paper. And or then you could looking at the Albers typewriter drawing, you could go on to the ways in which the typewriter has been used as a kind of because it's a mark-making machine, as a drawing device, and the various artists have used typewriters as a drawing device. And you look at the Dom Sylvester Houédard around the corner again, next to the mirror chandelles. This is an artist primarily known as a poet, but what you have is a drawing that uses there aren't words written, but there's where the Anni Albers is a kind of repeated structure. You have the typewriter used as a machine for intentionally producing drawings and manipulating the paper and on the carriage, etc. And so there's the human act. The human is also interfering with the machine. And then then Darrel Viner and the Frederick Hammersleys on the wall. Frederick Hammersley's over there, and Darrel Viner's in the thing, are two early instances of artists engaging with a mark-making machine which has a intelligence of some sort, has a memory that allows the marks to emerge, and trying to interfere or persuade what is either a tracking or marking machine to produce, to work in a way that produces, instead of a message, it produces a drawing. So the Hammersley uses a golf ball typewriter, and it overwrites some of the things that have gone before. It kind of reverses, goes back, kind of types down, so that blanks, so that there is a set of instructions that produce the series of drawings there. And with Darrel Viner's, these are a group of drawings that he made when he was still a student at the Slade, and he had access to a stylus, a computer-driven stylus in the lab there, and it's giving instructions to the pointer to produce a set of marks on the paper, and then letting the machine loose in order to act according to those instructions. And I suppose you could also think that the sense in which the gap between the instructions and the result is possibly also a thing of interest. In a way, also, Helga af Klimt was working under instruction. She had, or the way that, although he's not included, absence. Polka might have, those drawings of Polka's when he talks about higher powers command. I mean, there's the gap between the instruction and the result is produces a kind of moment, or produces a kind of I don't know what to call it. It produces something of interest. You could see in the Garth Evans drawings over there something like this, and the process is kind of evident. They're all done by a similar process. Sorry. These three, these are the Garth Evans. They're all done with a similar process. Although where an original square is cut up and then reassembled, so that they're fragmented and reassembled. There's some interesting connections. I'm going to lose the microphone. Like Garth's drawings here, I think, so this is a scribbled drawing, and then it's cut up and reassembled on the paper. And I think he started in the middle and worked out, and then he realised that actually he had to do a halves. So we have to cut these bottom ones into half. And I'm sure the halves weren't originally included in the plans. The plan was just that somehow by starting in the middle, he hadn't quite realised that he'd have to make halves when he got to the outside. So I don't think that he cut squares and half squares. I think he cut the original drawing up into squares, and then when he got to the edge, he realised he had to cut the last group of squares he had into halves. And so and there's a kind of funny connection with David Rossiter's drawing, which starts also in the middle of the square here, and then goes out progressively. The drawing is done by painting the central square and then painting the squares adjacent to it, gradually kind of slippage as it moves out. Whereas on this one, this one of Garth's is a more mechanical process. There's two sorts of graph square paper, and there's a bigger square here, and it's the square that is cut is at an angle to the squares on the paper. It's jumbled them up and stuck them back together again. Or like in this, the original drawing is kind of a scribble, and then it's kind of cut up and reassembled on the paper. And it's and there are within that process there are rules and there are accidents, and it's in a way the conjunction of rule and accident is at least a part of the of my at least a part of the thing that I find interesting. Or in Sam Messenger's drawing here, these the pentimenti around the side, which are purely to do with trying to get a recalcitrant drawing instrument to work, are enormously informative about the drawing in the middle, as if the kind of arbitrary nature of these marks, the unthought out nature of these marks, qualifies the thought nature of these. So this is there's a kind of automatism involved in this sort of this kind of activity to trying to get the pen to work, which is so these marks are kind of really unconsidered, and then there's a within the middle there's a set of very considered marks, although they also diverge from and there's slight variations within that consideration, which add kind of considerable visual interest. The way that I've hung the show has depended a bit upon trying to draw connections between various things. There's a good example again in the back room, where the Gordon Matter Clark and the Malevich and the Nasreen Mohammadi photograms are displayed together, and they have formal affinities each to the other, and then there's a deeper sense in which those formal affinities allow you to see the work next to it in a different kind of way, on the way in which the cuts in the Gordon Matter Clark come to seem close to the light marks in the on Nasreen Mohammadi's photograms. Allows you to think of light as a kind of cutting process, or cutting as a kind of photographic process, and with the Malevich as a kind of bridge between between them. And I should perhaps, the show begins with the first thing you see when you come in is a wall drawing, and it's the only it's the only drawing in the show which is located on the surface of the gallery, and it uses tape applied to Victoria Haven's wall drawing through there. Uses tape applied to the coloured tape that applied to the surface, although there's a kind of curious way in which the tape drawing both resembles and feels a bit like the cut drawing of Gordon Matter Clark, and that so the rabbit hole in the title refers a bit to cartoon holes. I don't know if you saw Roger Rabbit, but there's a very nice scene in Roger Rabbit where they have a box full of cartoon holes, which he throws a black hole onto the floor, a black disc onto the floor and immediately becomes a hole down which you can escape, which is a cartoon, a nice cartoon device, but and is also a nice kind of filmic dialogue about the ways in which we read marks or read shapes. So you can also read the David Batchelor's black shapes as being both holes and barriers at the same time. I'm not keeping track of the time. How am I doing on? Oh yeah, I've done about half an hour, so I can. There is a tendency within this exhibition for there to be a slight preponderance of rule-based works. And I don't think there are, that's partly to do with my taste. I'm obviously a rule-based kind of person. And it's, there are some things that I would have liked to have included that I didn't. Partly through difficulties of getting it. I mean, it's hard to imagine fitting anything else in here. But there were one or two drawings that I would have that I would have liked to have included that are slightly more that are less obviously rule-based. There was a Luciano Fabro drawing that that I was trying to get hold of, which is very light and very kind of very quick. And there aren't so many very quick drawings in here. There are obviously the Latham around the corner, which is 1 second, is a quick drawing, but a lot of the drawings are dependent upon a fair amount of invested time in the production. So and I say in the catalogue, I mean the Sound Messenger takes this obviously takes a long time to do, or the Richard Wright over there. I mean these are, or the Lothar Goetz, the two here. These are obviously things which have been paid close attention to over a long period. It doesn't necessarily mean that if you spend a lot of time on it, it's a good drawing. But that happens to be the. But this, like I say, there seems to be the John Goldings and probably the Mira Schindels are the kind of quickest drawings in the, and the John Latham seem to be the kind of quickest drawings in the show. I'll just say something else about the hang. Where an artist is represented by more than one piece, I've tended to hang them together if it seems to make sense for them to be together. So it would make no sense to hang David Batchelor's drawings around the room, whereas it does make sense to hang Thomas App's 3 drawings separately from each other, because or Richard Wright's three works separately from each other, because they each is a kind of each is a slightly different approach. Or the two, or the John Goldings are separated by Anish Kapoor, but then there's a third John Golding over there, which is very different in that it's kind of a collage structure. I think that's about all that I'm going to say as an introduction. Oh, well, there's one other thing. I tried to. Most of the drawings come from either American or European artists, but it was a very strong part of my intention that shouldn't be that it shouldn't be a kind of NATO show. That I've been equally interested in things from Japan and South America and from the Middle East and from India, I've included because I don't think abstraction is a Western European phenomenon. I think it's something that is kind of global in its in different ways, and it's inflected differently in different situations. So that the Shama Mania Farafanian is clearly comes from a slightly different tradition, although it's inflected by an approach to making mistakes, or kind of that is familiar to us. So that it brings in ideas about patterning and non-representational productions, which derive from a different traditions than the Western European tradition. So the yeah, that's about it for the beginning. So I'm going to pass it over to Anna to continue. And before, I won't take questions now. You'll have to save them up. Unless you want me to do questions now rather than passing it on.
Maybe we should do questions after Anna's.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's fair, because otherwise we'll get into kind of discussions which could go on for a long time. So if you have strong questions, I think you should try and remember them and address them to me. Thank you.
So hi everybody, my name's Anna Lovatt. I'm a lecturer in art history at the University of Manchester, and my research focuses on drawing really in the context of post-minimal and conceptual art, so specifically looking at the New York art world of the late 1960s and early 70s, and very often thinking about the kind of rule-based drawing that Richard has just mentioned. So some of the artists I've looked at in my research are Sol LeWitt and Ruth Vollmer, Dorothea Rockburn, Mel Bochner, and Richard Tuttle. And Rockburn and LeWitt are both in the exhibition in the other room. I've also written on Bob Law, who is also in the other room. So this is really the perspective from which I approached the catalogue essay that I wrote for the show, and also that I'm going to be approaching this talk. So when I started to think about the exhibition, the first thing I really tried to interrogate was the title, Abstract Drawing, and what these two words might mean when they're brought together. And I was interested to find that the etymology of the term abstract really comes from the Latin trahere, which means to drag or to draw, and abs, which means off, away, or from. So really, the term abstract, even when considered alone, involves a kind of drawing away or retreat from something. And this was of great interest to me, the sense that abstract also entailed a kind of drawing in terms of a drawing away from, a retreat, or a kind of process of recession. So pairing the term abstract with drawing then implies a kind of oscillatory movement, a kind of drawing and withdrawing, if we understand abstract to come from this sense of drawing away from, a movement back and forth or to and fro. And also, I want to suggest today, a tension between a process of acquiescence and one of resistance. And I'm going to explain a little bit more what I mean about this oscillation between acquiescence and resistance in a moment. So Catherine de Zeger, who obviously was the director of the Drawing Centre in New York and has written extensively on drawing, has equated abstract art with a kind of bilateral process of drawing from and drawing form. So she locates abstraction in the space between form and no form. And this is in a book called 3 Times Abstraction, which looks at Hilma af Klint, Emma Kuntz, and Agnes Martin. So she has also identified this oscillatory movement between form and no form. But this formalist understanding of abstraction is obviously only one definition of that term. And another thing I'm interested in is the way in which the term abstract has resonance beyond the visual arts in philosophy, for example, or sociology and economics. So the term abstraction has been used to describe the kind of transformation of economic and social relations that we've seen in late capitalist society. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this today, but writers including Maya Shapiro, Theodor Adorno, and also Peter Halley have identified abstraction not just as a tendency in modern and contemporary art, but also as a pervasive process that might be used to describe an increasing detachment and alienation of individuals in late capitalist society. So abstraction is not necessarily just a process that artists are engaged with. Instead, it might describe something that's happening more broadly, the abstraction of relationships between people, the abstraction of labor in the production of the commodity, for example. And recent commentators on abstraction have began to emphasize the pervasiveness of this word, its relevance beyond the field of the visual arts, while highlighting the connections between its formal, conceptual, economic, and social manifestations. So the exhibition Abstract Drawing brings together very divergent approaches to abstraction. And I think when we look around the room and the next room, we can really see juxtaposed materialist and spiritualist sensibilities, but also geometric and lyrical aesthetics. So I think on one level, the exhibition could be seen to demonstrate the irreducible heterogeneity of abstract art, the way in which abstract art is not a homogeneous category. Instead, it encompasses artists as diverse as Jackson Pollock and Sol LeWitt, both on view in the other room, and also Thomas Abts, who is on view here, and Hilma af Klint, again, in the notebooks in the case in the next room. So these are artists who seem to have little in common on the surface of things. And I think it's difficult really to identify a single unifying concern or characteristic running throughout the exhibition or through abstract art. And really for me, this testifies to the richness of both the exhibition and abstraction more broadly, the sense that abstraction can be a whole multitude of things. It can't be reduced to a single tendency or a single characteristic. So given the heterogeneity of the works in the exhibition, really for the purposes of this talk, I want to focus on artists who make visible these links between formal abstraction, abstraction in the visual arts, and also processes of resistance, disengagement, and retraction operative in the world at large, so beyond the field of the visual arts. I'm going to be talking specifically about the work of Anni Albers, whose pinprick and typewriter drawings Richard mentioned. They're in the case in the next room. Also, Frederick Hammersley, whose computer drawings are on the end of this wall as you come round towards the doorway, just behind you. Dom Sylvester Houédard, whose typextracts are in the next room, on the other side of this wall in this gallery. And Sol LeWitt and Darrel Viner, both of whom are on show in the next room. So the reason I've chosen to talk about these artists particularly is that I think in their work, a kind of retreat from representation towards the abstract occurs in conjunction with a strategic withdrawal of the authorial hand, so a retreat from the act of inscription, which is often facilitated by some kind of mechanical or electronic device. And that could be a very simple device, such as a pin in the case of Anni Albers, or a much more complex device, such as the stylus in Darrel Viner's computer drawings, which use the computer to generate marks. So I'm interested in these different processes of retreat and withdrawal, a withdrawal from representation, but also a withdrawal from the act of mark making itself by inserting some kind of intervening device into the production of drawing. And I think it would be easy to interpret this kind of work as the inevitable products of a society in which subjective expression and also human relationships have been irrevocably eroded, that is to say, abstracted by technoscientific advancement. And if any of you are familiar with Benjamin Buclow's writing on drawing, this is exactly what he thinks, that drawing becomes more mechanical and less subjective as our freedom as individuals is constrained throughout the 20th century. So I think we could say Buclow has quite a dystopian view of the possibilities of drawing today. Nevertheless, he does say that this constraint itself generates acts of resistance, and he very much talks about Eva Hesse's drawings in that way. So I think you could take that slightly dystopian view, but I'm not going to in my talk today. Instead, I want to suggest that just as this phrase abstract drawing implies an oscillatory movement rather than a unilateral movement, we could suggest that the works in the show that I've mentioned might be more productively located in a kind of in-between space of radical ambivalence. So they're not necessarily all about the constraint or restriction of the individual. Instead, they could be more about a to and fro between resistance and acquiescence that I'm going to be discussing further today. So I want to talk about this space of radical ambivalence in the work of the artist just mentioned, and to think about how this moving between drawing and withdrawing, but also between a kind of advancement and a process of retraction or acquiescence and resistance, might be played out in the work of some of the artists in the show. So I'm going to go through and just talk about a few key examples. And first of all, I want to talk about the work of Don Sylvester Houédard. So these are the drawings that are on view on the other side of the wall here. And Houédard, as you may know, was a Benedictine monk, a countercultural figure, and also a concrete poet who is really credited with introducing concrete poetry to Great Britain. And like Richard Deacon in his essay and his talk, Houédard suggested that all art involves some kind of abstraction. So he said all art is abstract on one level. And you could say as a poet, he was particularly attentive to that because, of course, language is inherently abstract. It involves assigning words to things or concepts in quite an arbitrary fashion. But I think we could also say of the visual arts and even of representational art that it always involves some kind of degree of abstraction or retreat from what it sets out to describe or relate to. With its economy of means, I think we could also say that drawing specifically highlights this process of reduction and abstraction that's inherent in any kind of cultural production. And Houédard associates concrete poetry with abstraction. So in concrete poetry, what you see is a kind of what we might describe as a thickening of the signifier, the way in which the word is really appreciated for its visual and material qualities as a thing in itself, rather than as something that represents something else. So we could say that in concrete poetry, you have an abstract system of signs that is language, which just have an arbitrary connection to what they describe. But by treating them as concrete objects, there's a further degree of abstraction. So they're actually withdrawn from those things that they represent or describe and appreciated, words that is, on their own terms. So this is what I mean when I talk about a kind of thickening of the signifier. The written word, the signifier, is withdrawn from the concept or the signified, what it represents, and appreciated it for its own visual and material qualities. So there are 2 degrees of abstraction here in concrete poetry. Along with this abstraction of language from its normal representational function that occurs in concrete poetry, Houédard used the typewriter to abstract and also to deconstruct the act of writing. So as I've mentioned previously, the typewriter is a device that physically withdraws the hand from the page. There's actually a kind of spatial recession when you're working on a typewriter as opposed to writing by hand. And we could also say that it substitutes the kind of orthographic idiosyncrasies of handwriting, the way in which the individual leaves a trace in the handwritten mark, for a set of predetermined letters, numbers, and symbols and spaces that are generated by a machine. Now, concrete poets really made use of the gridded structure within which the typewriter lays out these symbols as a means of contesting and reconfiguring the linearity of the written text. So concrete poetry often uses the gridded structure of the typewriter to arrange words and letters spatially instead of in the linear fashion you might expect in a conventional text. So it's using the grid to disrupt linearity. But in his works called the Typstracts, Dom Sylvester Houédard goes one step further. He actually breaks even with the typewriter's grid by feeding paper into the roller at an axis or on an axis. So when you look at the 2 typstracts on this wall, on the other side of this wall, you'll see that the symbols emerged going in different directions. He's not working according to that grid of the typewriter. Instead, he's feeding the paper into the roller, shifting it, and then feeding it through again. So here he's breaking even with the typewriter's grid in order to produce these works. So Dom Sylvester Houédard worked on an Olivetti Lettera 22. He was very particular about the kind of machine he was using. And he also used different coloured ribbons and would vary the pressure in order to achieve shifts in tone. So although I've spoken about the typewriter as being a mechanical device, a device that works with a predetermined set of symbols, he does manage to make these incredibly varied, surprisingly varied typstracts using that device. And typstract is the term that he uses to describe the works that you'll see on the opposite side of this wall. He also used tape and masks to arrange these typstract units and really creates these quite evanescent geometric forms that seem to hover in an indeterminate space. And one of the things that, again, is very interesting to me is the way in which Houédard's use of the typewriter is so different to that of Anni Albers, because Anni Albers' typewriter works appear to be very flat, really very much like a piece of fabric, whereas Houédard's typstracts are much more spatial. We could even say they're infinitely spatial. They also do away with words and letters in favour of slashes, hyphens, and full stops. So Houédard, as I mentioned, is known as a concrete poet, but you can't read the works in this exhibition in any kind of conventional way. So here what we have are these symbols removed from the semantic structure of a sentence, and I think we could argue that they function more like a kind of drawing. One of my questions for Richard, which I'll ask him afterwards, is how these works on the typewriter set up a relationship between drawing and writing, and whether we can understand the work of Houédard to be a kind of poetry or a kind of drawing, or perhaps both. The poet Bob Cobbing, who was a friend of Houédard and corresponded with him, questioned whether the typstracts were poetry at all, or even concrete poetry. He described them instead as a kind of abstract art made on a typewriter. So despite the fact that Houédard was known as a poet, these works are described in a very visual way by Bob Cobbing. And you can't really read them in any conventional sense, but I think when we look at them, we might imagine them as being sort of soundscapes, percussive, shimmering soundscapes. And in fact, Houédard likened them to electronic music and experiments that were going on contemporaneously in the 1960s and 70s in the field of music. Visually, he suggested that the typstracts look a little bit like cloud tracks, or tide ripples, or bracken patterns, or gulf lights. So he's aligning them really with these abstract patterns that occur in the natural world that do not emanate from any single individual or author. So again, attempting here to eliminate the authorial hand and voice from his work and to suggest that these patterns almost seem to emerge organically. I think we could say that the retreat from signification that's evident in these typestack works is also accompanied by a relinquishment of the authorial signature, which is facilitated by the typewriter. And Houédard described the typewriter as a kind of poetry machine. So it's a machine that generates poetry and displaces the author. The poetry seems to emanate from the machine rather than from the author, or perhaps from some kind of dialogue between the author and the machine. Now, again, to relate back to the argument about the abstraction of labour implicit in these drawings and how that might be played out in society more broadly, Houédard didn't see these things as being a kind of mimicking the abstraction of labour in late capitalist society. Instead, he saw this retreat from subjective expression in Mallarméan terms. So he sees it as something that is liberating rather than constraining, and it liberates poetry from the tyranny of the author by using these mechanical and systematic devices. So rather than thinking of the system as something which constrains the individual, Houédard considers it to be something that might liberate him from himself. So I've talked a little bit about Houédard, and the next designer I wanted to talk about is Anni Albers, whose work is in the cabinet in the next room. Now, clearly she's working in a very different context, and she's a designer rather than a poet. But like Houédard, she also sought to eliminate that which was too subjective from her work. And Albers actually suggested that designers should try to move away from their own personal foibles or suppress their own personal foibles in the interest of achieving a balanced and good design. She asserted that the good designer is the anonymous designer. And she also suggested that in weaving, the weaver should try to cooperate with her materials, tools, and machines instead of imposing her will upon them. So again, she sees this relationship between the designer and the machine as a kind of dialogue or interchange, rather than the designer submitting to the machine or the machine submitting to the designer. Now, Albers experimented with a variety of inscriptive devices, and Richard has already mentioned the pin that she uses in Teaching Study Made with Pinpricks, which is this small and really intricate and beautiful work in the cabinet in the next room, and also the typewriter that, like Houédard, she used in a series of typewriter studies. So in the pinprick piece, a sheet of paper is worked very densely and closely on both sides using the tip of a pin. And when you look at it closely, you can see that there are two types of puncture in the sheet. One is where the pin has been pushed from front to back, and there you get these sort of concave holes in the page. And the other where the pin has been pushed from back to front, where you get these protruding fibres encircling a smaller hole. So even using this very simple device of the pin, she creates these two quite different effects on the same sheet of paper by travelling from back to front and from front to back. So here, paper is treated as a sheet of material to be worked on both sides, rather than a surface to be inscribed. And the same thing happens in some of Dorothea Rockburn's work. You have the sense that paper is a kind of topological sheet that's dynamic, that can be folded and manipulated, rather than simply a passive receptive surface for inscription. So the typewriter for Albers offered a means of representing texture on a flat surface, creating what she described as tactile textile illusions. And I think this is a really nice way of describing the way in which her typewriter pieces relate to a piece of fabric. She describes the typewriter pieces as tactile textile illusions. And they're these really dense and variegated fields that are kind of analogous to woven textiles. So she's creating something that looks like a textile, but using the typewriter. So in her typewriter study in the next room, she uses the bracket key and also the hyphen key to generate this kind of rippling grid that bears a striking resemblance to the warp and weft of a piece of fabric. And I've mentioned it before, but one of the things that's really noticeable is the way in which this tightly woven mesh has a kind of flatness that is diametrically opposed to the spatiality of Houédard's typestracts in this room. So I think this indicates the rich creative possibilities offered by this shared mechanical device of the typewriter, and again suggests that rather than constraining the individual, this device might actually open up a whole range of very rich and diverse possibilities. So while Houédard painstakingly composed his works by manoeuvring the paper through the typewriter, using stencils and applying masks in order to arrange the figures, Albers' typewriter studies are structured according to a kind of predetermined system. So she uses an algorithmic approach, having a kind of formula to work by, which she also was using in her weaving at the same time and in her teaching. So she would have some of her students make these pinprick studies in order to generate weavings. When she was a tutor at the Bauhaus, Albers experimented with automated Jacquard looms, and these were really the first machines that used punch cards to generate a series of operations. So for the Jacquard loom, the design would take the form of a chain of these cards, which would be punched with holes, a little bit like the holes she punches into that drawing in the other room. And each card would correspond to one row of the woven design. So then when you changed cards, feeding them into the Jacquard loom, you would change the pattern of the loom's weave. And this has been seen retrospectively as a kind of precursor to later developments in computer programming. So rather than designing the pattern, you're actually designing a kind of code that is fed into the machine on these punch cards. So Albers' punch card designs, and also the designs of her students, have been compared to later developments in ASCII art. ASCII stands for the American Standard Code for Information Interchange. And this is a kind of code that is based on the 128 letters, numbers, and punctuation symbols that make up that code, and has more recently been used to generate computer-programmed art. So we could see her work with the Jacquard loom and these punch cards as prefiguring these much more recent developments in computer programming and ASCII art. And for that reason, I think we could consider her typewriter studies not just alongside Houédard's typestracts, but also alongside Frederick Hammersley's computer drawings. And these are the drawings that appear on the edge of the wall behind you as you go round towards the door. So I'll talk a little bit now about Hammersley. Now, Hammersley is an artist who's really best known for his geometric paintings. And during the 50s, these were labelled as kind of a form of hard-edge abstraction, which was opposed to the gestural brushstrokes of abstract expressionism. So again, we get a sense there of the diversity of abstraction at these different moments in history. So he's known really as a painter, but for a brief moment in the late 1960s, Hammersley experimented with computers while he was teaching at the University of New Mexico. So he was invited to attend a computer drawing class, which was run by somebody called Charles Mattox. And it was using a computer program which would be prepared on punch cards, a little bit like the kinds of cards that would be fed into a Jacquard loom. And they would be fed into a computer that would then generate drawings. So it was described as a computer drawing class. And it was really an intersection of the visual arts and computer science at this quite early stage in the late 1960s. So students would use the alphabet, the letters of the alphabet, 10 numbers and 11 symbols. And using that sort of set of symbols, they could work on a grid consisting of 105 characters horizontally and 50 characters vertically. So you're working within quite tight constraints here as to the set of symbols you're using, but also the way in which they're going to be laid out on this grid. By using one or more punch cards, you could generate straight lines, curves, and shapes. So despite the fact that the repertoire of symbols is quite limited, it can actually generate quite diverse visual effects, and that really is borne out by the kind of effects that Hammersley achieves in his own drawings using the computer. Now, perhaps surprisingly, Hammersley likened computer drawing to painting. So he said there wasn't that much that was different between these two aspects of his practice. And he insisted that the elements are just the same, and in the end result is simply an image. So he didn't see that much difference between his paintings and his computer drawings. Now, he did say also that it wasn't enough for that image just to be aesthetically pleasing. It had to be what he called an image of substance and significance. So he would do away with some of these computer drawings if they didn't meet that standard after they'd been produced. Now, Hammersley's attempts to master the technique of computer drawing resulted in lots of kind of errors and mistakes, but also in unexpected outcomes, so fortuitous mistakes and errors that generated things that were very good, which he had not expected to turn out so well. And he really described this unpredictability as part of the fascination and the challenge of the computer. So you could say that Hammersley embraced the limitations of the machine, and obviously it is quite a limited device in the late 1960s, as well as its possibilities. So that unpredictability of working with the computer is something that I think does differentiate it from painting, because rather than producing a sketch, what Hammersley would be feeding into the machine would be a code punched into a punch card. So it would have no visual correspondence with the image that would be generated. Really, he didn't know what was going to come out of the machine when he fed these punch cards in. And that unexpectedness is something that he found kind of intriguing as well as being frustrating. So when you look at the drawings on the end of this wall, there's one called Dashing, Myopic, Leon. I'll talk about these titles in a moment. They're quite perplexing. And it's really made up of this dense field of dots and dashes, which, when they're overlaid, so using these very basic symbols but overlaying them, creates broken and also straight and undulating lines that are quite similar to Albers' typewriter study made on a different kind of mechanical device. And the simplicity of that piece really contrasts with Hammersley's other work, another work in the exhibition called By the Numbers. And in this piece, he uses every single letter, number, and symbol at his disposal, instead of simply using dashes and dots, to create these complex geometric structures that vary in depth and tone. So you can overlay marks to create this tonal depth, as well as having a single layer of marks, as he does in some of the other drawings. Now, when you look at the titles, so one of them is called Up-Down Stick. They relate quite closely to other works by Hammersley. So there's another work not in the show called Up, Down with a Stick. There's also Dashing, Myopic, Leon in this exhibition, and other drawings that are related to it called Dash Every Third and Myopic. So these are all from 1969. So what you get is words in the title recurring in other drawings, and that indicates that they're generated by a single computer program, which he has simply adapted to generate related but distinct drawings. So when a word recurs in different titles, it means that those drawings originate from the same computer program, but he's just adapted it slightly to achieve different results. So some of these titles use the kind of found phrases that Hammersley used to title his paintings. For instance, there's one of the computer drawings that's not in this exhibition, which is called Clairol, after the hair dye. And he uses these words that he's excerted from advertising or slogans or conversations to title his paintings. But other of the computer drawings use words that seem to refer to the alphanumeric code. So, for instance, this word dash that keeps recurring in the titles, and also to the kind of dazzling visual effects that are achieved in the computer drawings themselves. So the word myopic, I think, relates to the visual experience of looking at the drawings. So Hammersley, as I mentioned, was really fascinated by the rich possibilities offered by the computer, but he actually worked with it for quite a short time. So he started working with it in 1969, and then quite quickly in the early 70s, he returned to painting. And he was really ambivalent about the abstraction of labour that was entailed by working with the computer. So he wrote, "My involvement and participation when working on the computer is very different from my feeling when painting," and we could say also drawing, which may be a shortcoming. "It might, on the other hand, be an asset to me. It may furnish me, upon return to drawing or painting, with new insights and added understanding." So really here, Hammersley suggests that by withdrawing from the act of inscription, the artist becomes disengaged from his own production. And he was slightly uncomfortable with that feeling of disengagement, which he said was very different to drawing or painting. But on the other hand, he also said that that very disengagement offered the possibility of critical distance. And in fact, that really turned out to be true for Hammersley. So after this impasse he'd reached in his painting practice in the late 1960s, he worked on the computer drawings, and then he returns to painting with new vigour following this kind of moment of experimentation. So we could say here that, yes, the computer drawings disengage him from the process of production in a way that he found slightly troubling, but they also seem to allow him to look at his painting production afresh, so they enable him to have a kind of critical distance. So finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the work of Darrel Viner. And these are the computer drawings that Richard mentioned that Viner produced when he was a student at the Slade, which are also in the cabinets in the next room. So Viner starts working with the computer several years later than Hammersley in the 1970s, and already the technology has evolved quite rapidly, and particularly what visual artists could do with the computer changes dramatically between 1969, when Hammersley was working, and the mid-1970s, when some of these drawings by Viner were produced. So Viner first used computers when he was studying at Middlesex Polytechnic in the early 70s, in collaboration with John Vince, who was a lecturer in data processing. And John Vince invented this computer program called Picasso, but it's Picasso with a 1S, which was one of the first computer programs used by artists. This is all discussed in quite a lot more depth in a book called Cold Heat White Logic, or Cold Logic White Heat, trying to remember which one, edited by Charlie Gear and others on British computer art of the 1970s and 80s. It's White Heat, Cold Logic, which discusses this really exciting moment in computer art in Britain. So Picasso was one of the first computer programs for artists, which was produced and experimented with by Viner and others during the 1970s. And John Vince, who developed the program, was really stimulated and also challenged by his dialogue with Darrel Viner. He felt that Viner really kept stretching the program's capabilities, asking him to do more and more with the computer, and thereby developing the remit of his program. He helped Vince to develop these features of the Picasso program called Rough and Sketch. These are two different features, which transformed computer-generated lines into believably hand-drawn marks, or marks that appeared to be drawn by hand. And those are the kinds of marks you can see in Viner's drawings in the next room. So for one of a series of works, Viner asked Vince to design a kind of computer program that would create a collection of random lines, each corresponding to a number. And he then overlaid these random lines to create cross-hatching, which he would then subject to further cross-hatching. So you have cross-hatching piled upon cross-hatching until he created these incredibly complex images comprising of thousands of lines of different length, spacing, and angles. And sometimes these instructions were so complex that they would confuse the computer and errors would become part of the process. A little bit like Hammersley, who embraced the sort of random or unexpected aspects of computer drawing, Viner really welcomed these errors or stutters in the process of inscription by the computer. So the way in which the machine becomes overridden or confused or overloaded was something that he actually welcomed and embraced. So following that moment at Middlesex, Viner studied sculpture and mixed media at the Slade, and there he became involved with the experimental and electronic art department. This was really a hub for computer art in the mid to late 1970s when Viner was there. And he began to make use of UCL's computer department. So they had recently acquired a pen plotter, which could actually inscribe marks generated by a computer. And Viner and other artists at the Slade began to use this new technology in their work. So one of Viner's contemporaries, Stephen Bell, described the process of drawing with a pen plotter, which is the mechanism used for the drawings in the other room. And interestingly to me, what he highlights is not the kind of rationalistic or systematic aspects to this kind of computer drawing, but instead its sensuous appeal. So there's something surprisingly sensuous about his description of the pen plotter. He talks about, and this is a quote, the controlled power and the tension of the mechanism of the plotter, the touch of the pen or brush on paper, and its unpredictable movements, the slow revelation of the final composition over several hours. So there's something expressive or sensuous or meditative about this process that really confounds the notion that computer-generated art is cold or clinical or rationalistic in appearance. Now, Viner himself described his works with the pen plotter as a kind of journey in mark-making, as if he's setting out on a voyage or a process of experimentation to produce marks that had not been produced before. And I think drawings like the ones in the next room are indicative of this process of discovery. So in one of the drawings, which is called number 51, and his titles are very often just numbers, the pen plotter generates all these different permutations on a simple cross. And you have a cross, but its four arms become skewed or contorted into a K shape or a V shape. These shapes converge and sometimes intersect, despite the fact that they're arranged in a regular fashion on a grid. So I think when you look at these cross drawings, they do have something in common with other drawings made by hand. I'm thinking of Eva Hesse's drawings using pencil-drawn X's on gridded paper. But by comparison, there's something unfamiliar and unsettling, I think, about Viner's works. So while the regularity of Hesse's crosses, and this is not one of the Hesse drawings in the exhibition, but I'm referring to her drawings on graph paper where she repeatedly draws a penciled cross in each square. The regularity of Hesse's drawings becomes undone by the wayward movement of her hand. So she's working systematically, but because they're hand-drawn pieces, the hand actually undoes that systematicity through a kind of waywardness. But in Viner's works, on the other hand, you have an appearance of randomness that is called into question by the recurrence of marks that appear unrepeatable. So you'll have a mark that looks as though it's drawn by hand and is unique, and then a few crosses down the series, it will recur, and you realize that these are not hand-drawn at all. They're actually drawn by a mechanical device. And I think there's something quite unsettling about that realization. So there are some interesting relationships here between that kind of automatic drawing, a drawing that is literally drawn by a machine, and the kind of drawing that is used by Jackson Pollock or Hilma af Klint, where automatism refers to a more psychic process of disengaging conscious thought and working in a way that appears to be directed from someone or something elsewhere. So we might imagine, I think, looking at these marks by Viner, these skewed and twisted crosses, that they've been generated by something like the kind of absurd or anthropomorphic or libidinous machine that Hesse herself drew in 1965 when she was working in Germany. And these are the drawings in the exhibition, which are Hesse's drawings of machines, but they're Duchampian machines in that they are erotic and whimsical and absurd. And perhaps being a little whimsical myself, I think we could almost imagine that those machine-drawn marks in Viner's drawings emanate from something like those kind of absurd machines described by Hesse. So I think here we're not necessarily dealing with an abstraction of human qualities or relationships, but instead a kind of perverse and playful displacement of those qualities onto the machine. And in fact, Richard spoke earlier about the idea of the human interfering with the machine, as well as considering the way in which the machine might interfere with or displace the human. So Viner is really best known for his kinetic sculptures, which are these mobile, again, mechanomorphic instruments. And talking about these works a few years ago, Guy Brett described them as philosophical toys that reflect upon the submission of individuals to the controls and orders of society. So I think these processes of acquiescence and regulation to a kind of system beyond our control are also evident in Viner's drawings. And we could, on one level, understand them to indicate the increasingly mediated or constrained nature of inscription and other forms of communication in technologically advanced societies. And once again, that would certainly be Benjamin Bucklow's view. Writing in the 1930s, Maya Shapiro argued that abstract art responded less to the mechanization of modern production than to the transformation of human relationships it entailed. So Maya Shapiro relates abstract art to what he describes as a submission to some external purpose indifferent to the individual that he sees at work in society at large. Now, Viner's computer drawings are formally abstract, but we could also say that they make visible the social and economic abstraction described by Shapiro, which is really made literal in their use of machines to generate believably hand-drawn lines. The curator Jasia Reichardt, who was responsible for the exhibitions Between Poetry and Painting in 1965 and also Cybernetic Serendipity in 1968 at the ICA, has drawn parallels between concrete poetry and computer art, which was really showcased in these two exhibitions in the 1960s. And I think we could say that like concrete poetry, like the work of Houédard and others, computer art is interdisciplinary, and it's also historically existed on the margins of the art world, and really still does, causing practices like Viner's to be overlooked. But the mechanization of the drawing process that we see in Viner's work does have something in common with the better-known practice of Sol LeWitt, who is displayed in the next room. And LeWitt also uses this algorithmic approach, similar to a kind of computer program, in order to generate different types of line in his drawing. So in the four-color drawing that you see just through this doorway here, it's the small drawing divided into four parts of a grid. LeWitt really relinquishes control of a fundamental component of drawing, that is composition, instead allowing a numerical sequence to determine the direction of lines and their colors. So he's really delegating the organization of that drawing to this very basic system. Now, famously, LeWitt wrote that in conceptual art, the idea becomes a machine that makes the art. And he really suggested that there was a disengagement of the artist from the labor of production in favor of a more administrative task. So LeWitt famously likened the artist to a clerk cataloguing the results of a premise in conceptual art. This abstraction of labour is furthered in LeWitt's wall drawings, where, unlike the works on paper, which you'll see in the other room, these were drawn by LeWitt himself. But in the wall drawings, he delegates the act of inscription to his assistants, who make them according to his instructions. So here, then, the artist withdraws not just from the process of organising or structuring the drawing, but also from the act of inscription himself by delegating that act to others. Now, early critics, such as N.O. Devling, writing in the 1970s, really viewed this surrender of authorial power in LeWitt's work as being a supremely democratic act. So the way in which LeWitt used assistance and removed himself from the process was seen as a democratic act by Devlin. But others, however, have viewed this kind of delegation as being autocratic, so LeWitt directing this process, which is attributed to him but enacted by other anonymous draftspeople. And also as bureaucratic, the use of certificates of ownership and production in LeWitt's work has been seen as bureaucratic and autocratic as well as democratic in those early years. So writing more recently, the critic Sven Luttiken has likened LeWitt's delegation of the wall drawings to assistance, to the kind of outsourcing of production by multinational corporations that we increasingly see in the contemporary world. And Luttiken has remarked that, this is a quote, abstract thought thus reveals its complicity with that other fundamental form of abstraction, exchange. So there he's aligning LeWitt's use of abstract thought with a kind of abstraction of economics and social relationships in contemporary society. But I think we could say that rather than suggesting LeWitt's work is either autocratic or democratic, we should actually say that perhaps the strength of it is its ability to support both possible readings. On the one hand, it shows this radical decentering of power or authorship, which could be understood as democratic, but on the other hand, that decentering could be indicative of newer and perhaps more insidious forms of control operative within the world at large that are decentralized and spread out. So to conclude, we could say that abstract drawing is an expansive category, and I think that's really demonstrated by the very diverse practitioners brought together in this exhibition. We could argue that all drawing entails some kind of degree of abstraction, particularly given its schematic and often monochromatic characteristics. But in my talk today, I've chosen to highlight just one strand of abstract drawing, which makes links between formal abstraction and processes of disengagement and alienation or retraction operative in the world at large. So I think in the work of Houédard, Albers, Hammersley, Viner, and LeWitt, a retreat from representation occurs in conjunction with a strategic withdrawal of the authorial hand, which is facilitated by the deployment of simple or sometimes more sophisticated mechanical devices. Drawing and withdrawing, these practices carve out a kind of ambivalent space between freedom and constraint, optimism and pessimism, acquiescence and resistance. And therefore, I think they really enrich our understanding of what the term abstraction means, both within and also beyond the visual arts today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's great. If you've got questions for Richard and for Anna, maybe Richard, would you like to? Can you bring your chair?
Will, yeah. I lost mine.
I wonder if we can have. So if you have a question, it would be great if you could. So now, so we've got a sort of. Yeah. Yes, good. That's going to be good. Thank you very much.
I've just got something to say that is a bit relevant to some of the things that Anna says. Because it strikes me there's something in my own history that makes my point of view perhaps particular. I don't know if you've seen The Bell Jar and the Butterfly, the movie where the man with who has a massive stroke and or read The Bell Jar and the Butterfly and produces the book has locked-in syndrome. He produces the book by means of he retains the ability to wink his eye, and produces the book is produced by using a kind of tracking device where you can nominate a letter by on a kind of square grid and then blink twice to get it to print. And and my mother suffered from motor neuron disease, and so she also, for a period, was unable to communicate, and then got given a similar device because she retained the ability to move her head to track. So, and then to drive a typewriter to produce text. So I've always thought that it was liberating rather than alienating the relationship to the mechanical device as a mark making, and it is. For me, it was kind of I kind of rediscovered my mother through that, and so I've always had this kind of very positive relationship rather than thinking that I think the distancing isn't necessarily an alienating thing; that it can be a liberating or a humanizing thing. But otherwise, I'll take so.
My question is really directed to Anna, but if anyone's got a question, perhaps it ought to be directed to Richard first.
You've got a question. Give you a question.
Thanks. I just wanted to really basically open up for a discussion, a response from you really about the sort of, in a way, you suggest a polarity within abstraction. On the one hand, perhaps one might reference Pollock, you mentioned being guided by some external agent or thing. And perhaps on the other axis of abstraction, Sylvester Houédard guided by the typewriter as a machine in a way. And yet when one reflects on that, one also reflects on the fact that Sylvester Houédard made this, had a calling or made a lifestyle choice, I mean, whichever you feel really, in becoming a Benedictine monk, which had its own structure and constrictions and possibilities and openings. And I've just wondered how you placed his work really within that sort of scope between the external and the automatous.
Yes, this relates to another interest of mine, which I had thought about trying to explore in the essay, but it became a bit unwieldy, which is the connection between these two seemingly divergent understandings of what the automatic might mean. So on the one hand, the automatic might mean a kind of automatic drawing that is seen to emanate from the unconscious, as in the work of Jackson Pollock or André Masson, for instance. But on the other hand, the automatic or automatic drawing could be a drawing that's literally generated by a machine. And I think they produce a very different kind of work, but the thing that they have in common is an aim to move beyond the conscious self or the conscious mind. And in Houédard's sense, that would be moving beyond the ego, which is also central to the work of someone like Agnes Martin. So Agnes Martin also talks about wanting to get beyond the individual and the self, but she means it really in a kind of Zen or Taoist sense. And I think perhaps we could say that Houédard, his urge to move beyond the individual is in pursuit of some kind of higher spirituality that requires the evacuation of the individual from poetry or visual art. So that evacuation of the individual has something to do with automatism, whereas in Pollock it's the evacuation of conscious thought in order to access something supposedly unconscious. So I think the aim is different, but there are relationships between the two, and the main relationship is the relationship of a kind of disengagement in order to access something else, whether you believe that something else is a sort of higher state of consciousness or it is the unconscious of the individual. So I think the two do relate, but the aim is different. Does that kind of answer your question?
Thanks, great.
I suppose mine's not really, it's more just to express something and to see what you think. But I was thinking so much about, as you're talking about precision and like constraints, precision, and the role of the hand and the role of rules, and how if I just take a broad scan through everything, that precision always seems to be there, and then its relationship and the lack of it, the dance between the artist and or the unknown, the unconscious, and the known part of the precision and the rules. And even like in there with those, it was like this very precise thing of cutting it up, but the hand put it back together again. So then this hand came into the precision, and in there, how that all happens. And so yeah, so I come from an architectural background, and I kind of go through these different processes, but I was just interested to see maybe out of that dynamic, just if you have any reflection on that, and yeah, just on that.
There's a lot of rule-bound art. There's a lot of rule-bound things in this show, and there's a lot of precision, and there's also but there's also I also think there's a lot of precision in most things. In some cases, it's clear to identify what one might mean by precision. The Lothar Goetz, seems to be clearly precise in a kind of particular sort of way, and David Austin's paintings are clearly precise and controlled, and although as you move away from the center, the problem between constraint and error starts to causes deviations from the system. Whereas you could look at precision also in relationship to something like honesty. So the Hilma af Klint, I don't think she was really trying to make things up. I think she was trying to get something down that she somehow experienced, and so there's some trying to kind of formulate a language in the way that she was drawing that would correspond to it. So they seem scribbly, but actually they belong to there's a sense of precision in the scribble, whereas in Garth's work, I think it is the scribbles on the one on the left are really uncontrolled. You just kind of scribbled over the piece of paper, and so and then the precision is applied subsequently in kind of dividing that up into a grid and cutting it up. Alison Wilding, in talking about her, there's a nice video when she talks about those drawings, and she kind of she describes them as being pretty chaotic at the beginning, and that the process of drawing is the process. By the end, she kind of knows what she's doing, but she kind of starts off by not knowing what she's doing. So and I think the Kapoors seem quite quick, quite kind of uncontrolled in some way. But there must be a point in which you. So they're not rule bound, but there comes a kind of point in which they're left behind, which they're finished, and the finishing is a kind of and whether that counts as, I don't know, does that count as precision for?
Yeah, that's why I was so interested in it, because it feels like if you go constraint precision the hand, and then the hand precision constraints. It's almost like it's this like thing in the middle that's just kind of threading it, or that is alive and everything. So I just wonder what that search was. And yeah. But that's,
and I think
okay,
so. I think in some instances there are ways in which the rules generate something that's quite precise, but in consequence there's a kind of freedom involved, and in the other, there's almost there's an opposite thing that goes on, that the freedom leads you to the understanding of a rule. So it's something like that. Okay.
I'd just add something to that, which is one of the artists who I've worked on in the past, but who's not in the exhibition, but is related certainly to the work of Hesse and LeWitt, who he knew quite well, is Mel Bochner. And I've spoken to him about the role of drawing in his conceptual practice, and he puts it down to this question of precision. And he says that when you learn to draw, you're learning to look precisely, but also to think precisely. And he's spoken about himself in the 50s having quite a conventional drawing education, a very academic drawing education, which is quite difficult to tally with his much more conceptual practice that is all about series and systems and numbers and notation. But he says the thing that links the two is this sense of precision in looking and precision in thinking about the similarities and differences between things, which could be in a representational drawing, or it could be in a drawing that's made up of a sequence of numbers. So I think to him that question of precision seems to relate a very conventional drawing-based education to a more conceptual practice that is all about systematic thinking, numbers, and relationships between things. But again, that question of precision being a key link between those two different approaches to drawing.
But I also think that actually at a certain point, in the 70s, having gone through a kind of periods of both radical and conventional art education, one of the things that did exist within art education was a drawing practice that in particularly in relationship to life drawing, that was that felt something like piano practice. That it was a rigorous conceptual process which had an objective correlate, and that you could but at the same time you had a kind of a strong input from within you, so that when I was a student at the Royal College in the Department of Environmental Media, I did go life drawing once every week for a couple of years, on the basis that I thought this was a kind of very interesting activity, and as someone that was conceptually sort of much more oriented towards conceptual practices, it seemed like I can understand what Mel Bochner is saying, because it does seem like something which has it's kind of your producing something which has some kind of objective correlate, and which is and a kind of activity which isn't it's a kind of task that you can do, and there are very few tasks in art education. There's very few activities you can do when you feel you can kind of do something in a task-like way to learn something.
I guess there are two questions, and they could relate to both. But and forgive me because I have not seen the exhibition yet, so no, really, except for what I can see from my seat. But I'm really impressed from what I see from here. It's already really interesting. I wondered, Richard, do you know the drawings of August Giacometti? Have you ever seen his drawings? He's one of the, I think he's the father of the two artists.
Diego's and father.
He was a fantastic abstract draftsman, and I thought he might. And I haven't seen the exhibition, but from what I can gather,
there aren't any Giacometti elder drawings.
Okay. Well, it might be interesting to look, because he could be a sort of interesting source for a lot of these discussions that we've been looking at as an abstract expressionist. And the other thing that comes to mind in relation to both of your talks is the origins of automatic drawing. That really, when I think of automatic drawing, I think of Max Ernst first and frottages, and the emergence of abstraction through his surrealist frottages that comes up in Histoire naturelle, for instance, and just the development of him rubbing the floorboards in his room, and how at first they begin as trees and surrealist dreams, and then they just become very basic rubbings of planks of wood. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering whether you considered looking at those or including those at all.
We didn't look at those. We looked at Masson's drawings.
Yeah.
And we either couldn't find the ones we wanted, or we didn't include. So there's a lot here that we looked at, which isn't included because we couldn't get the ones we wanted. I would have liked a Chillida drawing, for example, or a Fontana drawing would have been very nice, etc. So there's a lot that we could have included, and there's some where one thing kind of has to stand in for a whole lot of other.
And I
so
can
the Pollock is actually taking a kind of lot of weight,
right,
in terms of that kind of automatism.
Yeah. If you could choose one work that you couldn't have in the exhibition, what would it be?
Which would I take away?
No, which drawing did you want to have but couldn't? Like, if you could choose anything from any museum that you would like to add to this.
Okay, so that's more difficult because each time you add something, it changes the balance of the whole, and so therefore you have to. And like I said earlier, I mean, I think that I am sorry that we don't have the Fabro drawing.
Oh right, yeah, you mentioned.
Because that's very different than anything we have in terms of its light. It's almost throwaway and deeply serious at the same time.
Where is that drawing?
It's in a collection in Switzerland.
And Fontana?
Fontana, yes, Fontana, but because we've got the Albers pinpricks and the Gordon Matter Clark cut drawings, there is some sense in which that's covered. Yeah, we do. I mean, a Fontana drawing would have been very conceptual spatial drawing would have been very nice to have.
Can I ask a last question? Sorry. I'm curious about your experience of hanging the exhibition, and if a lot of the juxtapositions came up before you hung it or while you were hanging it.
Mixture of both. Mixture of both. We did. There are some that became much clearer when things were here, and some where the grouping, the things were clear. There's some that are determined by situation. So the Pollock and the Malevich and the Klimt have to be in there because the light levels.
Oh right.
And the more historical drawings have to be in there because of the light levels. I mean, it doesn't. The same for actually Darrel Viner's things. They're kind of limited by there's light level restrictions on those as well. Although I like the conjunction of Darrel Viner and Anni Albers in the showcase.
Well, thank you very much.